Mom sneered, "You'll never be as good as your sister." I stood up and said, "Then let her pay your bills." The room went silent. I am Flora, 32 years old, the younger of 2 daughters. My entire life, Mom compared me to my perfect sister, Rebecca. That fateful dinner when Mom sneered those words, something inside me finally snapped. 20 years of feeling second best culminated in that moment when she said, "You will never be as good as your sister." The silence in the room was deafening after I stood up and delivered the response I had held back for decades. If you have ever been compared to your siblings, drop a comment below and subscribe to hear my full story of how I finally found my voice and changed everything. Growing up in our suburban Chicago home, our family looked picture-perfect from the outside. My father worked as a mechanical engineer at Boeing, bringing home a stable income and occasionally surprising us with small gifts from his business trips. My mother was a meticulous CPA, her organizational skills extending from her office to our immaculate home. And then there was Rebecca, my sister, 5 years my senior, and the undisputed star of our family. Rebecca was everything parents dream their child will be. With her natural beauty, straight A's, and seemingly effortless talent for both violin and tennis, she was the golden child in every sense. Teachers would light up when they learned I was Rebecca Martinez's little sister, immediately expecting the same brilliance from me. Unfortunately for them, and for my mother, I was not Rebecca 2.0. From my earliest memories, I was average in most traditional metrics. My grades hovered around B level, not terrible, but certainly not spectacular. Math was particularly challenging, and I would spend hours at the kitchen table with papers scattered around me, fighting back tears as I struggled with fractions and equations that Rebecca had mastered years before at a younger age. What I did have was a love for art and creativity. By age 6, I filled sketchbooks with colorful drawings, creating entire worlds with my imagination. I would proudly present these creations to my mother, hoping for the same enthusiasm she showed for Rebecca's achievements. I remember one particular evening when I was 7 years old. Rebecca, 12 at the time, was performing Chopin at her piano recital. She sat tall on the bench, her fingers dancing across the keys with precision and emotion that belied her young age. The audience erupted in applause when she finished, my mother dabbing tears of pride from her eyes. The next day, I completed a painting of our family that I had worked on for an entire week. I carefully carried it to the living room where my mother was reading. "Mom, look what I made for you," I said, holding out my masterpiece with both hands. She glanced up briefly. "That's nice, Flora, but why is the sky purple?" "Skies are blue, honey. And look, your father's arm is too long. You should pay more attention to proportions." I stood there, my small hands gripping the painting tighter, feeling my chest tighten. "I made the sky purple because I thought it looked pretty." "Well, it's not realistic." "Rebecca was drawing perfect still lives by your age," she replied, already returning to her book. I quietly took my painting back to my room and slid it under my bed, where many of my not good enough creations would eventually gather dust. My elementary school graduation day was another stark reminder of the disparity in how our achievements were viewed. I had worked hard all year and received mostly B's with a couple of A's mixed in. As we walked to the car after the ceremony, my report card in hand, my mother scanned the grades and sighed. "Rebecca was getting straight A+ by your age, Flora. If you just applied yourself a little more, you could do better." I remember looking at the ground, watching my shiny graduation shoes scuff against the pavement. The pride I had felt moments before evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. It was my father who often served as my emotional lifeline during these years. Unlike my mother, he seemed to see me for who I was, not who I failed to be in comparison to Rebecca. He would sit with me as I drew, asking questions about my creations and sometimes even requesting specific drawings for his office. One night, after a particularly difficult day of comparisons, he came to my room and sat on the edge of my bed. "You know, Flo," he said, using the nickname only he called me, "not everyone is meant to shine in the same way. Some stars are bright and obvious, like the North Star. Others might seem less noticeable at first, but when you really look, they have colors and qualities all their own." I didn't fully understand what he meant then, but his words gave me comfort. At least one person in my family saw something valuable in me. Despite these moments of support, the consistent message from my mother and the subtle reinforcement from extended family and teachers was clear: I was living in Rebecca's shadow, and my own light was dim by comparison. I developed coping mechanisms early. I became adept at smiling and nodding when people asked about my sister's latest accomplishment. I learned to redirect conversations away from academic comparisons. Most importantly, I built a private internal world where I promised myself that someday, somehow, I would find something I could excel at, something that would make my mother look at me the way she looked at Rebecca. But as each year passed, that promise became harder to believe. The gap between Rebecca's achievements and my own seemed to widen rather than narrow. And while part of me began to accept that I might never measure up, another part still desperately yearned for my mother's approval. By the time I finished elementary school, I had developed a complex relationship with achievement and recognition. I both craved it and feared it, knowing that whatever I accomplished would inevitably be measured against Rebecca's gold standard. Still, I held on to hope that middle school would be different, that I would finally find my place to shine. That hope, like many before it, would prove more complicated than my young heart anticipated. The summer before I entered 8th grade marked a significant turning point in our family dynamic. Rebecca had not only been accepted to Princeton University, but she had received a full academic scholarship. Our house transformed into Celebration Central, with relatives and family friends constantly visiting to congratulate her and my parents. I remember the party my mother threw, our living room adorned with orange and black decorations, Princeton memorabilia prominently displayed on every surface. As I helped arrange platters of sandwiches and chips, I overheard my mother telling her friends, "We always knew Rebecca was destined for greatness. From the moment she started talking in complete sentences at 18 months, we just knew." I was 13, awkwardly navigating the early stages of adolescence while feeling increasingly invisible in my own home. That night, as guests fawned over Rebecca, I slipped away to my room, turned up my music, and began sketching aggressively in my notebook, the pencil sometimes tearing through the paper. When school started that fall, something in me had shifted. The eager-to-please student disappeared, replaced by a girl who no longer saw the point in trying. My grades, which had never been stellar but were at least respectable, began to slide. C's and even a few D's appeared on my report cards, each one met with increasing disappointment and frustration from my mother. By mid-semester, I was called to the guidance counselor's office. To my mortification, my mother had arranged the meeting. She sat primly in one of the office chairs, her back straight, hands folded in her lap, expression grim. "Flora has always been a bit of an underachiever compared to her sister," she explained to Mr. Thompson, the counselor, as if I wasn't sitting right there. "But this recent behavior is concerning. Her sister was class president by this age and preparing for advanced placement courses." Mr. Thompson, to his credit, tried to redirect the conversation. "Every student has their own journey, Mrs. Martinez. Why don't we talk about Flora's interests and strengths?" But my mother wasn't interested in that conversation. The meeting ended with a behavior improvement plan that involved weekly progress reports and restricted privileges until my grades improved. It was around this time that I discovered a new outlet for my creativity and rebellion. The local community center offered weekend art workshops, and I began experimenting with urban art styles, fashion sketches, and mixed media that felt worlds away from the traditional still lives and landscapes my mother thought constituted real art. My wardrobe gradually transformed too. Gone were the preppy outfits my mother preferred, replaced by thrift store finds, band t-shirts, and accessories that made me stand out rather than blend in. I dyed a purple streak in my hair, a decision that resulted in a 2-week grounding and an endless lecture about respecting my appearance. "What will people think?" my mother lamented. "Rebecca never went through a phase like this." "Maybe that's the problem," I shot back. "Maybe I'm tired of hearing about what Rebecca would do." My social circle shifted as well. I gravitated toward other creative outcasts who didn't fit the conventional mold of success. My best friend Amanda became my lifeline during these turbulent years. With her green-tipped hair and passion for photography, she represented everything my mother disapproved of, which made our friendship all the more valuable to me. "Your mom has Rebecca goggles on," Amanda told me one afternoon as we sat on the bleachers after school, avoiding going home. "She can't see past her perfect firstborn to realize she has another awesome daughter who's just awesome in different ways." Those words stuck with me, providing a framework for understanding the dysfunction in our family that didn't require me to be the problem. Despite my apparent academic apathy, I continued to develop my artistic skills in secret. When my high school announced a student fashion design competition during my sophomore year, I worked for weeks on my entry, staying late after school and working at Amanda's house to keep it hidden from my mother. The day of the announcement, I could barely contain my excitement when my name was called as the first place winner. My design, a reimagined vintage-inspired dress with modern architectural elements, had impressed the judges from the local art college who oversaw the competition. That evening, I burst through the front door, trophy and certificate in hand, ready to finally share an achievement my mother could be proud of. "Mom," I called out, finding her in the kitchen preparing dinner. "I won first place in the design competition." She looked up from the vegetables she was chopping, her expression more confused than pleased. "The what?" "The fashion design competition at school. Look." I held out the trophy, a small figure holding a swatch of fabric aloft. She put down her knife and wiped her hands on a towel, examining my prize with a frown. "I didn't even know you entered a competition. When did you work on this? Is this why your algebra grade slipped to a C- last month?" My heart sank. "Does it matter? I won, Mom. Out of the whole school." She handed the trophy back to me with a sigh. "Flora, if you spend half the time on your academics that you do on these art projects, you might actually have a future like your sister. Rebecca was already preparing for college entrance exams by your age, not wasting time on hobbies." Something snapped inside me then. "It's not a hobby. It's what I'm good at, what I love. Why can't you see that?" "What I see is potential being wasted," she replied coldly. "These little creative projects won't get you into a good college or provide a stable future." "They're not little projects to me," I shouted, my voice cracking with emotion. "And maybe I don't want Rebecca's future. Maybe I want my own." It was our first real confrontation, the first time I had openly challenged her vision of who I should be. I ran to my room and slammed the door, clutching my trophy and sobbing into my pillow. My father came in later, sitting quietly on the edge of my bed and placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "She just wants what's best for you," he said softly, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. "No," I replied through tears. "She wants what's best for Rebecca. She wants another Rebecca." That night marked a turning point in my relationship with my mother. The unspoken tension between us had finally found its voice, and there would be no going back to polite pretending. The situation grew increasingly strained when Rebecca graduated summa cum laude from Princeton and immediately secured a position at a prestigious law firm in Manhattan. Once again, our home became a shrine to Rebecca's achievements: framed diploma, law firm offer letter displayed on the refrigerator, constant phone calls from relatives congratulating my parents on raising such an exceptional daughter. All the while, I was preparing for my own graduation, applying to colleges with strong art and design programs, and trying to chart a course that felt true to myself. But with each step I took toward my own future, I felt the weight of comparison growing heavier, threatening to crush the fragile sense of identity I was building. When my college acceptance letters arrived, I received good news from several art schools, including a partial scholarship to the University of Illinois' respected design program. It wasn't Princeton, but it was exactly where I wanted to be. I imagined my mother would at least acknowledge this achievement, but her response was predictably underwhelming. "University of Illinois," she said, eyebrows raised as she looked over the acceptance letter. "I suppose it's better than community college," though Rebecca had offers from Ivy League schools across the board. I had anticipated this reaction and was surprised to find it hurt less than expected. Perhaps I was finally developing immunity to the constant comparisons. Or maybe I had simply reached the limit of how much I could care about her approval. Move-in day at the university dorms brought a sense of liberation I had never experienced. My small but bright room, shared with a music major named Zoe who spent most of her time at practice rooms, became my sanctuary. For the first time, I could decorate my space exactly as I wanted, work on my designs at any hour, and exist without the looming shadow of Rebecca's perfection. The first few weeks of classes were overwhelming but exhilarating. I found myself surrounded by people who thought visually, who valued creativity and original perspectives. In my Introduction to Fashion Design course, I met Professor Linda Carter, a former designer for major fashion houses who had returned to academia to nurture new talent. After our third class, she asked me to stay behind. My stomach tightened, conditioned to expect criticism when singled out by authority figures. "Your preliminary sketches show real promise, Flora," she said, flipping through my work. "There's a distinctive point of view here, raw, but with strong instincts for proportion and unexpected detail." I stood frozen, unsure how to respond to praise that felt so foreign. "Thank you," I finally managed. I see a lot of students with technical skill, she continued, but fewer with authentic vision. Keep developing this voice. It's what will set you apart in this industry. I walked out of that classroom feeling taller somehow, as if her words had physically straightened my perpetually hunched shoulders. Someone who knew what they were talking about saw value in my work, not in comparison to anyone else, but on its own merits. As the semester progressed, I began to find my rhythm academically and socially. I joined the university's fashion society and made friends with other design students who shared my passion. For projects, I developed a style that blended structured tailoring with unexpected materials and street art influences, a combination Professor Carter encouraged me to refine. In my sophomore year, I met Jake in a color theory class. He was studying graphic design, quiet but with a quick wit that emerged once you got to know him. Unlike the guys I had casually dated in high school, Jake was genuinely interested in my work and ambitions. He would sit for hours in the studio while I draped fabric on dress forms, offering thoughtful feedback and bringing me coffee during late-night creative sessions. Our relationship developed slowly, built on friendship and mutual respect. He never made me feel like I was competing for attention or validation, something I hadn't realized was possible in a relationship. Despite the positive changes in my life, the weekly phone calls with my mother remained an exercise in patience. She would ask perfunctory questions about my classes before inevitably steering the conversation toward Rebecca's latest accomplishments. Rebecca just closed her first major case, she would announce. The partners are already talking about fast-tracking her career. Or Rebecca and David just put a down payment on a condo in Soho. At her age, can you imagine? When Rebecca got engaged to David, a successful corporate attorney she met at her firm, my mother spent our entire call describing the ring, the proposal, and the prestigious connections of David's family. You should really talk to your sister about how she managed to find such a good match, my mother suggested. Maybe she could introduce you to some of David's colleagues. I glanced at Jake, who was sketching at my desk, oblivious to my conversation. I'm seeing someone, Mom. I've mentioned Jake several times. Oh, the art student, she replied, her tone making it clear what she thought of that. Well, that's nice for now, dear. The implied temporariness of my relationship was typical of how she viewed my life choices, transitional, experimental, eventually to be replaced by more sensible decisions that aligned with the Rebecca template of success. By my junior year, I had established myself as one of the standout students in the design program. My work had been featured in the department showcase exhibition, and Professor Carter had selected me for a competitive teaching assistant position. I was building a portfolio and beginning to think about internships that could launch my career after graduation. Then came the announcement of the National Student Design Competition, an annual event that attracted entries from top design schools across the country. The winner would receive a cash prize and, more importantly, an opportunity to have their work seen by industry professionals. I spent months developing my collection for the competition, pushing myself to create pieces that were both innovative and wearable. Jake and my friends witnessed the evolution of my designs, offering encouragement during moments of doubt and celebrating small victories along the way. The night before I was scheduled to submit my final portfolio, my phone rang. It was my mother, calling for our weekly check-in. Hi, Mom, I answered, pinning a final piece to my presentation board. Flora, did you hear about Rebecca's promotion? She'll be the youngest senior associate in her firm's history. That's great, I said automatically, the response ingrained after years of practice. We're just so proud. Your father and I were saying how all those late nights studying have really paid off for her. There was a pause, and I knew what was coming next. How are your classes going? Still doing those fashion projects? I took a deep breath. Actually, I'm just finishing my entry for the National Student Design Competition. It's a really big deal in the industry. Oh, she said, her voice flat. Well, don't get your hopes up too high, honey. These creative fields are so competitive, and not everyone has natural talent like your sister has for law. There's no shame in being realistic about your prospects. I closed my eyes, phone pressed to my ear, surrounded by the evidence of months of hard work and growth. Thanks for the encouragement, Mom, I said, not bothering to hide the sarcasm in my voice. I'm just being honest, Flora. Not everyone can be exceptional like Rebecca. Sometimes being average is perfectly fine. After we hung up, I sat motionless for several minutes, her words echoing in my head. Then, with deliberate movements, I returned to my work, channeling the hurt into a final push to perfect my submission. As I completed the last details, I made a promise to myself: whether I won or lost this competition, I would no longer measure my worth through my mother's eyes. It was time to be the authority on my own value. 6 months into my position with Emma Wilson's design team, I graduated with honors and secured an entry-level position at Meridian Designs. I received an invitation that filled me with equal parts obligation and dread: my mother's 60th birthday dinner. Under normal circumstances, I might have found an excuse to send my regrets, but my father's voice on the phone had that particular tone that told me my absence would hurt him deeply. "It would mean a lot to your mother, Flo," he said. "Rebecca and David are coming in from New York. It'll be the whole family together." So I found myself on a Friday evening in early autumn, parking my second-hand Honda in the driveway of my childhood home, steeling myself for the inevitable comparisons and subtle put-downs that characterized family gatherings. The house looked exactly as it always had, meticulously maintained and decorated with tasteful restraint. As I walked up the path to the front door, I could already hear voices inside, the familiar cadence of my family's conversation bringing both comfort and anxiety. Rebecca answered my knock, looking as polished and put together as ever in a tailored dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But her smile seemed genuine as she pulled me into a hug. "Flora, you look great," she said, stepping back to examine me. "I love your outfit. Is that one of your designs?" I nodded, surprised by her interest. The dress I wore was indeed my own creation, a simple but distinctive piece with architectural details at the shoulders, made from repurposed vintage fabric. "The structure is amazing," she continued. "You have to tell me about your new job." Before I could respond, our mother appeared in the hallway behind Rebecca. "Flora, you're finally here," she said, moving forward to offer her cheek for the obligatory kiss. "We were about to start the appetizers without you." Dinner proceeded as expected at first. My father had prepared my mother's favorite meal, grilled salmon with asparagus, and the conversation revolved primarily around Rebecca's work and her life with David in Manhattan. I picked at my food, offering appropriate responses when directly addressed, but otherwise fading into the background as I had learned to do years ago. Then, over the main course, Rebecca cleared her throat and exchanged a meaningful glance with David. "Actually, we have some news," she announced, her face glowing with excitement. "I've been promoted to lead counsel for the firm's international division." My parents erupted in congratulations, my mother actually clapping her hands together in delight. And Rebecca continued, her smile widening, "We're expecting. I'm 3 months pregnant." The news of my impending niece or nephew momentarily overshadowed even the impressive career announcement. My mother's eyes filled with tears as she rushed around the table to embrace Rebecca, while my father beamed with grandfatherly pride. I offered my own sincere congratulations, genuinely happy for my sister. Despite the familiar twinge of inadequacy her achievements always inspired, I loved Rebecca. "A toast," my father declared, raising his glass. "To Rebecca and David, and to the newest member of our family." We all raised our glasses, my mother dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. "My first grandchild," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Rebecca, you've always made us so proud. And now this, it's perfect." As the excitement settled and conversation returned to details of Rebecca's pregnancy and plans for the baby's room, I found myself wanting to contribute something positive to the evening. Despite years of disappointment, some childish part of me still craved my mother's approval. "I actually have some news too," I said during a lull in the conversation. All eyes turned to me, and I felt a nervous flutter in my stomach. One of my designs has been selected for inclusion in New York Fashion Week's showcase for emerging designers. There was a moment of silence before Rebecca spoke. "Flora, that's incredible. New York Fashion Week is huge." My father reached over to squeeze my hand. "Congratulations, Flo. When is it? We should all try to be there." "It's next month," I replied, warmed by their reactions. "It's just one piece in a group showcase, but it's a big opportunity for exposure." I looked toward my mother, hoping for some sign of enthusiasm. Her expression was polite but noticeably less animated than it had been moments before. "Is that so?" she asked. "Well, that sounds nice. Is it the main event, or some sort of sideshow?" The dismissiveness in her tone was so familiar it almost didn't hurt anymore. "Almost. It's part of the Emerging Designers platform," I explained, keeping my voice even. "Many successful designers got their start there." She nodded, her interest clearly waning. I suppose any exposure is good in your field. She turned back to Rebecca. Now about the baby shower, I was thinking we could host it here, maybe with a garden theme since the due date is in spring. The conversation moved on as if my news had been nothing more than a minor interruption. I fell silent again, pushing food around my plate and wondering why I had bothered to share my achievement at all. Later, as we moved to the living room for coffee and birthday cake, my parents began discussing plans for their upcoming 40th wedding anniversary. We were thinking of renting a venue, my father explained. Nothing too elaborate, but something nice to mark the occasion. Those places charge a fortune these days, my mother said, frowning. I was looking at the garden room at the Palmer House, but their minimum is $3,000, not including food or drinks. I could contribute, Rebecca offered immediately. Consider it part of your anniversary gift. That's very generous, sweetie, my mother beamed. David's firm must be treating you well. We're comfortable, Rebecca acknowledged modestly. And we want to help make it special for you both. My mother turned to me, eyebrows raised expectantly. And what about you, Flora? Will you be contributing as well? The question was loaded with awareness of my financial limitations, which she had never bothered to understand were a normal part of establishing oneself in a creative industry. I can help with the planning and design elements, I offered. I could create custom invitations and decorations that would cost a fortune if you hired someone. My mother's expression tightened. I was thinking more of financial assistance, Flora. Your sister is offering to help with the actual expenses. I know what Rebecca is offering, I replied, an edge creeping into my voice. I'm offering what I can. Which is not much, my mother said with a dismissive wave of her hand. As usual. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. David suddenly became very interested in his coffee, while my father shot my mother a warning look that she ignored. I don't understand why you insist on struggling in this fashion hobby when you could have pursued something practical, she continued. Your sister was practical, and look at her now. Senior position, beautiful home, baby on the way. You could have had all that too if you had applied yourself properly. I felt heat rising in my face. Fashion design is not a hobby, Mom. It's my career, a career I've worked incredibly hard for. Working hard at the wrong thing is still wasted effort, she replied. Let's be honest, Flora. You will never be as good as your sister. I think I've finally accepted that fact. Perhaps you should too. The words hung in the air like a slap. 20 years of comparisons, disappointments, and diminished achievements crystallized in that single brutal statement. I looked around the room. Rebecca appeared mortified, my father stunned into silence. My mother sat primly on the edge of her chair, her expression suggesting she had simply stated an obvious truth that everyone had been too polite to mention. Something shifted inside me in that moment. The hurt was still there, but it was overshadowed by a sudden, surprising clarity. I stood up slowly, my hands steady despite the emotions churning inside me. If I will never be as good as Rebecca, I said, my voice calm and clear, then perhaps you should ask her to pay your bills. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's mouth opened slightly in shock, her cheeks flushing with color. Excuse me, she finally managed. You heard me, I continued, finding strength I didn't know I possessed. If Rebecca is your measuring stick for success and value in this family, then direct all your expectations her way. Ask her to fund your anniversary party. Ask her to validate your life choices. Ask her to fulfill whatever dreams you had that I apparently keep failing to meet. I took a deep breath, years of suppressed thoughts finally finding voice. For 20 years I've tried to make you see me, not as a comparison to Rebecca, but as my own person with my own talents and dreams. But you've never been interested in who I actually am, only in who I fail to be. That's not true, my mother protested weakly. I just want what's best for you. No, I shook my head. You want what's best for you. You want the prestige of having 2 Ivy League-educated, conventionally successful daughters you can brag about to your friends. But that's not who I am, and it's not who I want to be. I turned to Rebecca, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of surprise and what looked like dawning respect. Rebecca, I love you, and I'm genuinely happy for your success. But Mom has used you as a weapon against me my entire life, and I can't pretend anymore that it doesn't hurt. To my surprise, Rebecca stood up and moved to my side. She's right, Mom, she said quietly. You've always compared us, and it hasn't been fair to Flora. Do you know how much pressure I've felt, knowing you were using my achievements to make her feel inadequate? Do you have any idea how that's affected our relationship as sisters? My mother looked genuinely confused, as if the possibility that her behavior had damaged both her daughters had never occurred to her. I just always pushed you both to excel, she said defensively. No, my father finally spoke, his voice unusually firm. You pushed Rebecca to excel in ways you valued, and you pushed Flora to be Rebecca. That's not the same thing, Elizabeth. The use of my mother's first name, something my father rarely did in family settings, underscored the seriousness of the moment. My mother looked at him, betrayal written across her features. I have sat by too long watching this dynamic, he continued. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere with how you parented, but I was wrong. I should have spoken up years ago when I saw how your constant comparisons were hurting Flora. My mother's face crumpled slightly, though whether from genuine remorse or simply from being confronted, I couldn't tell. I felt suddenly exhausted, decades of emotional suppression taking their toll now that the dam had broken. I think I need some air, I said, moving toward the front door. No one tried to stop me as I stepped outside into the cool evening, closing the door behind me with a soft click that somehow felt like the period at the end of a very long, complicated sentence. I sat on the front steps, breathing deeply and feeling simultaneously lighter and terrified. I had finally said the words I had been holding back for most of my life, but I had no idea what would happen next. Would this be the end of my relationship with my mother? Had I irreparably damaged our family? Or was there some possibility, however small, that this confrontation might lead to healing? As I gazed up at the emerging stars, I realized that regardless of what happened next, I had finally stood up for myself and my worth. For the first time in my life, I had refused to accept the narrative that I was a lesser version of my sister. Whatever came next, I would face it as Flora, on my own terms, no longer defined by who I was not. 1 year later, much had changed. The exposure from New York Fashion Week had led to valuable connections and opportunities, eventually allowing me to establish my own small design studio. My relationship with my family had evolved in ways both expected and surprising. My father and I grew closer than ever, his pride in my accomplishments now expressed openly and frequently. Rebecca and I developed a relationship founded on mutual respect rather than comparison. The birth of her daughter, my niece Lily, brought a new dimension to our connection. I designed a special christening gown for the baby, incorporating subtle elements from family heirlooms, a gesture that moved Rebecca to tears. The most complex evolution, predictably, was with my mother. Our relationship remained a work in progress, with steps forward often followed by slides backward. But there were new moments, ones where she made visible efforts to understand my world on its own terms. She had started asking questions about design and fashion, awkwardly at first, but with increasing genuine curiosity. She had even framed a sketch I had given her, displaying it prominently in their living room alongside Rebecca's law school diploma, a small but meaningful gesture of equivalence. The most profound change, however, was internal. The confidence that had begun to emerge the night I finally stood up to my mother had grown stronger with each passing month. I no longer measured my worth through comparison to Rebecca or anyone else. I had built a life that reflected my values and vision, one where success was defined by creative integrity and personal fulfillment rather than external metrics. Sometimes the most powerful act is not achieving some external measure of greatness, but simply standing up and speaking your truth. Not to hurt others, but to free yourself from the limitations they have placed upon you. In that moment of standing, you discover that you have been enough all along. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who constantly compared you to others? How did you find the courage to define success on your own terms? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear that they are enough exactly as they are. Thank you for joining me on this journey of self-discovery and healing. Remember, the most beautiful thing you can be is authentically yourself.